In art, you know, you can be, if you want to, you can slam dunk right away. You don't need to know how to, you know, play defense or anything. I just wanted to be well-rounded, and I thought it would be fun to take a painting class. And then I got challenged. Why is that color beautiful, and is it beautiful? I think about stuff like that so much in my studio that it makes me dizzy. If you want to have any kind of dialogue with an audience beyond your studio, your work has to live in some context. If I made abstract monochrome paintings without this ulterior meaning, I wouldn't be here talking to you. God, it's just huge. These first few slides are from around 1987, so a little over 10 years ago. Not too long after I really started. So I was making this work back then that I consider my student work, even though I wasn't really an art student. I kind of had the notion back then that this was work that really had to do with me. Anyway, this is early work. This is early work. It's student work. It's a 5 by 10 foot diptych, and it's kind of speeded up in time, so the disappearance, the slow disappearance of the figure is not as slow as it actually was. I started making these fairly reduced but still figurative pieces on paper, really small pieces of paper with charcoal rubbed all over them, all over the sheets, and then oil paint worked on top of it. I don't know if you can see this piece very well, but I remember it was in 1989, summer of 89. I remember thinking very consciously that it was transitional, a significant transitional thing as I was making it, because I thought it was the first abstract thing that I'd ever made. And I realize in retrospect that it's not at all abstract. I mean, it's just obviously it's this pill shape or a magnet shape. And I remember very clearly drawing that ballpoint pen line on top. I don't know if you can make it out. Drawing it on top of the wet oil paint and getting rid of it and drawing it again until it was just quirky enough, not too perfect, just quirky. And I was looking at people's work like Myron Stout and Forrest Bess, these kind of American, self-made American visionary, so-called visionary painters. There are a few drawings here that somehow remain in my slide carousel, even though I just have no idea what I was thinking about when I made them. They're very strange. It's funny, I'm starting to make some paintings that are a little bit related to these, and this is still just around 1990. And still, I mean, we haven't, even though several years have passed, we still haven't passed out of what I think of as the work that I would have been making had I been an art student. But I was pretty much on my own. This is a series of a number of paintings that I made that I called maze paintings. And as you can see, they're not very difficult mazes. But it's the first time that I'm really becoming concerned with surface in a certain kind of way in my work. And it's the first time that I started to use hot, medium, and caustic. Between 91 and 92, around there, I was making a lot of work that looked at 70s art. And I was making all these pieces having to do with process. This is that same paper. I got a lot of this paper when I was in St. Louis. This is that same paper that had charcoal rubbed all over it, the same kind of paper. And this is drenched in linseed oil, pinned in one corner, and then simply with a graphite line that goes in the direction of gravity approximately, and then ends up on the wall a little bit. Same paper. Roofing nails glued to the paper on the left and just simply pushed through the paper on the right. I'm not sure why I took a picture of both of these together, because they're actually two separate versions of the same painting, of one painting. It's not a diptych, in other words. And this is one of the very few self-consciously political paintings I've made. I kind of am stopping to mention that because of the juncture in just the time at which I started to show a lot. I got pegged as a political artist. This is one of the few paintings that I started out to make a sort of political statement. It was right after Tiananmen Square massacre. I borrowed a friend's bird hunting rifle, and just it was a pretty scary thing. I did this in my studio in Brooklyn. So any artist who's delving into the 70s ends up having to use the requisite beeswax and latex rubber. Safety razors aren't mandatory, but there they are, held together on this 10 by 8 inch canvas with beeswax, and on the right in a pouch of latex. You know, somebody pointed out to me last time I gave this lecture that that's uncharacteristically kind of scary. And believe it or not, although I was interested in that, you know, that thin skin of latex and those really sharp razor blades, I didn't think it was that scary. So as you can see, although this is all very process-oriented, it's all still trying to be painting, you know, at least nominally. And it's you know, let's say this is my grad student work at this point, even though I'm not in graduate school. I would say that it's at this juncture that most people would just, okay, say, forget it. I mean, I'm not really a painter anymore. But somehow, that didn't happen with me, and it's been interesting for me to think about why. I was talking earlier today with some students and described this thing that eventually came to be called a belly painting. That thing in the middle, I just wanted to make a painting with too much paint in it. I stretched latex rubber over a panel and poured 3 gallons of latex paint between the panel and the sheath of latex. So I thought I was making this thing that looked, you know, that was very processed and very 70s, and, you know, the few friends I had coming over to the studio those days, every one of them came in and said, "Oh, a belly painting." And I certainly hadn't referred to them as that. It wasn't just one person, everybody referred to that as a belly painting. So at first I was annoyed because I didn't really think it had to do with the body. For some reason I thought that kind of debased it. So this was a good lesson in retrospect. I finally started listening to them and started to think of them as belly paintings. You couldn't resist touching them. You'd touch them and they would bounce up and down. But they wouldn't last very long because UV light and people touching, the combination of that, and people touching them, and just that severe stretching finally would make them fall apart. At any rate, I started to think about, I guess, sort of joined them and started to think about them as belly paintings. Blue belly, yellow belly. Which was a good thing because it was lucky or smart or something. Because they really led directly to these skin paintings that I made. I was thinking of Bryce Martin's, and this is the moment at which I, for a number of years, became an abstract monochrome painter. I started thinking of Bryce Martin's early work, which I really like, and how how people talked about that early work and talked about it as sort of having a skin, and especially, you know, looked at these paintings as being anthropomorphic, finally. So I decided very literally to make paintings of people's skin color. This is because those other ones weren't archival. I made these out of encaustic, and which lasts a long time. I believe this is the first skin painting I made. It's a self-portrait. The color on the left, the color of my arm, approximately, and the left, the color under my arm, of my underarm, and then the hairs under my arm glued to that little painting. I don't know if you can make out that little cloud of armpit hairs. This diptych, I wish I had photographed it closer with the two panels closer together. On the, so this is many layers of hot, medium, and caustic, and obviously black and white. But you know, when you see the paintings, they look pretty rich because they're very layered, with slightly varying colors between the layers. So on the right, in the last layer, I had really long hair at that point. I took a whole handful of black hairs and knifed them in randomly into the last layer. On the left, you might be able to make out right in the middle just one hair. It's my first gray hair. It's just right in the middle. This is a painting called Please Do Not Touch. It's made in my favorite fine art oil pigment color, which is cobalt violet light, and also with oil and wax. And in the very last layer, I just put my hands all over it, fingerprints. So these are the first first elements of this big piece called synecdoche, which is a literary term meaning a part that stands for the whole. And as you can see, the first dozen or so, and you can probably pick most of them out in this photograph, weren't exactly monochrome. I tried to duplicate a lot of the different colors of the person who was sitting for me, of their skin color. So I was generally looking at their arm or the back of their neck and just a very small, minute area and trying to copy the color. So what happened was I had about a dozen of these in my studio, and this guy came who I went to school with, who had been running a nonprofit space. He saw these, he came to look at my belly paintings, and he saw these, and he said that he wanted me to make enough of them to fill the small wall, the big wall in his gallery, and that he had the perfect Kiki Smith painting to go with it. So I was really excited about that. I thought he knew Kiki Smith, and he didn't, but it turns out that she's very friendly and very interested in helping people who need help. The show was in a few months, so the next couple of months that's all I did was I went out and I asked, first I got all my friends, but I didn't have 200 friends. So I was out on the street, in the park, asking people. I carried my French easel and my oil paints and asking people if I could look at their arm for half an hour. And so I'd make these paintings on site from observation. This is how they're ordered. The little sign on top says synecdoche, the date, my name, blah, blah, blah. And then that's the list of names in the same order in which they're installed, which is alphabetical by first name, because I didn't want the whole Rodriguez family together. But so instead I have all, what's so funny about that? Instead I have 7 Lisas in a row, for instance. When I look at this piece, it's hard for me to look at this piece. The only time I can really see it very well is when I give these lectures, when it's installed, for some reason, I don't know if it's just too large or too, in all senses of that word. But I'm always much more, I can identify much more with this thing because I still remember most of the people, even if it's just really slight memory. Somehow the names. This piece was eventually, because of that show with Kiki Smith, as a direct result of that, it was in the '93 biennial. This is a piece that I did at the New Museum. It's the first of a number of wall paintings that I've done in the past few years. It's sort of in progress. It's called The Skin Ego. This is not a very good slide because it doesn't give an indication of how big it is. The wall is probably about 15 feet high, and the image bleeds off the sides, and it's here I usually talk about that kind of the kind of painting post-war American painting that I have been really interested in the last several years. Rothko, Pollock, Newman, etc., the New York School painters, whose work, for the most part, I really admire. So a lot of my work has come kind of in the form of their work, or very much influenced by their work, but with an alternative content. That work, back in the context of that time, tried to be about, and was about, very large subject matter like life and death subject matter, chaos, anxiety, the universe. My paintings, on the other hand, instead of being about subjects that are too large for words, tend to be almost about things almost too small for words. This is a series of drawings I did, a little bit like some of the drawings that are in the show here, where I sent friends of mine. There's this one line of foundation cosmetics. It's custom blended. You walk up to the counter in the department store and plunk down your $50, and they mix your skin color, basically. Somebody told me about this. I was kind of amazed, and I went there, and they were doing exactly what I had been doing. And I was even further amazed to find out that they learned how to do this in a weekend seminar. But you could tell. Some of them, basically some of them were really good, and some of them just didn't know what the heck they were doing. So I would try to get the person who was good at it, and I had, my friends get their foundation custom blended, and then they'd have to give me this little vial of it, and I made these drawings that are in mathematical ellipses in which the minor axis is the width of their cheekbones and the major axis is sort of the height of their face. One of the most interesting things about this project was finding the compass that could draw these ellipses. I thought it was going to be really easy, but the one that's easy to get cost $800, but eventually I got one that worked just as well, but after calling around a long time, I got one for really cheap. This is one of the pieces in the show here called Black and White. It's a collaboration with Glenn Ligon. Originally, it came about, this collaboration came about because we did a show at that same gallery where I'd originally shown it with Kiki Smith, but this is a couple of years later. I did a show with Glenn that was of all of collaborative works, and on the right, those pinkish, beigeish paintings look like panels from Synecdoche, but they were by themselves this piece of mine called Flesh, and they're straight out of the tube flesh colors from Winsor Newton, Grumbacher, Sennelier, Liquitex, etc. They're not mixed. And on the left, did I say on the left before? On the left, anyway, the same order, the same paint companies, but different blacks, ivory black, matte black, carbon black, etc. This is called Lisa Siegel, Byron Kim. It's a portrait of my wife and me, very much in the style of those early Bryce Marden paintings. Although they're not very, the touch is not, he just has an incredible touch. I rode on a truck while I was making these paintings. The stupid job I had was to ride on a truck moving artwork. The guy who drove the truck happened to have been a studio assistant of Bryce Marden, so whenever we stopped for lunch, I'd quiz him about how much talcum powder he used, what size the coffee can was, how big the palette knife was, et cetera, et cetera. This is the second of paintings called Mom. So this is called Mom 2. It's one of the few paintings that I've done that isn't from direct observation. I could have gone to California and done it from direct observation, but it seemed to me that this color, the color of my mother's skin, is a special color. It's my sort of like first surface, first color, maybe. And it was nice to me to think of imagining it. And I made 3 of them. I was going to make, so this is Mom 3, and as you can see, even though part of it's the photograph, you can see that it's a very different color. It's much darker. That's because my memory is not necessarily that consistent. This painting, I was going to make another one, which would have been, this is a pretty big painting. I mean, it's like 8 feet tall. I was going to make another one that was maybe 10 feet tall and about 15 feet wide and call it Mother, but I just couldn't bring myself to do it. So this one ended up being called, first it was Mom 3 and now it's Mother. It was in my second solo show in New York, and by that time I wasn't doing only skin paintings, and so there was all this other work in the show, and then only this as a skin painting. It's the only show, gosh, is it the only? It's definitely the only solo show that my mom has seen. It's the only opening she's been able to come to. So she comes to the show in New York, and the show's finished. I mean, the opening's finished, and she comes up to me. We're all going out to dinner. The only thing she has to say to me is, "It's too dark." This is called Emmett at 12 months. It's tiny, tiny panels, like something like 2 3/4 by, maybe 3 1/4 by 2 1/4 or something like that. And it's all these colors on my son's body when he was a year old, including his birthmark called the Mongolian blue spot, and the color of his lips, and the white of his eyes, his hair color. So it's not only skin color, but it's mostly skin color. The color behind the lobe of his ear, below his foot. It's Mom and Emmett. These 2 paintings are versions of my versions of Ad Reinhardt's black paintings, and they were photographed before they were finished, or else you wouldn't have been able to see the same 9 square grid that he used. And they're both black. They're called Black Painting Number 1 and Black Painting Number 2, and of course they're of particular people's skin color. This is a piece called Signature that it's probably the only time I've hung a piece in a show, realized it wasn't really a piece, or it wasn't quite there or done, but I couldn't really do anything about it because I thought it was something in my studio. At any rate, it's a number of variously colored, abstract, monochrome paintings that are signed in the bottom right. You know, you're not supposed to sign abstract paintings like that on the front. And these signatures are not my signature. I painted them on there. I sort of forged them, but they're signatures of all these many people who have influenced me throughout my life. So, for instance, the yellow one to this mid-center, the left center, says Elizabeth R. Friedman on it. She was this person who, from 6th grade all the way through college, well, 6th grade through 12th grade anyway, and we went to the same college too. Whenever I scored a 96 on something, she would inevitably score a 98. Never failed, so I couldn't stand her. At first, I grew to really appreciate her, and in retrospect, she's like one of the most influential people I've ever been with, because she's sort of like, she's extremely, what's the word? She was pretty smart, yeah. She was really formative. She had this really formative effect on me, because I'm really used to being number 2, and I kind of grew accustomed to that position, because it became impossible to be number 1, and it's a position that I've grown to really actually thrive in. This is the painting that's to the left of that painting. It says Walt Frazier, Clyde. So I actually went to a Knicks game recently, and he's an announcer. He was my idol when I was growing up. He's my boyhood idol, and I got his autograph recently at a Knicks game, because he's an announcer now. He was the great Hall of Fame point guard for the championship New York Knickerbocker teams of the early 70s. This is a drawing that's in the show. Collage. You see this, this paper mill that I've done some work with asked me to be in this paper fashion show. So I made this piece, because Clyde he really began sports fashion. I mean, it's huge now, but it sort of started with him and his Puma sneakers, Puma Clydes, back in the 70s. And this is a replica of his jersey made from fashion photographs. Of course, his jersey actually said Frazier, but I used his nickname instead. This is a piece called Pops Jordan, which is in the gallery. It's in the color of the car that his dad was driving when they found him. His dad was killed. He wore the number 45 when he came back after his retirement in honor of his father. The piece is about death, actually, and about not only about death, but about this kind of sensationalized death, and about this kind of death that everybody finds out about and how horrible it is, and kind of sympathizing with that there was a real person, because something like that actually happened in my family. And so, although that painting looks very cool, it's a very warm, very sad painting to me. This is called NBA, and it's the team colors of the NBA in the order that I thought they would finish at the beginning of the season that I made these paintings. These are 12th century Korean pots. I made a series of paintings from direct observation of some of these pots. Korean people are really, really proud of these part of their culture, this part of their culture. So they talk about these kinds of greens with a lot of pride, and my father sort of, even though I grew up here, he was able to sort of indoctrinate me about that. But I still, I really grew to appreciate them as an adult. And it occurred to me when I was talking to another Korean American artist who grew up in Korea, to ask him about what he thought about these colors and were they indeed beautiful. And he said, of course they're beautiful. And we talked about it. I tried to get him to talk about beauty and why these are beautiful. And finally he got a little bit impatient with me and he said, I can't tell you why these are beautiful. It's just that they are, because I've been told that since I was a little kid. So they just are beautiful. I don't know why. And it kind of reminded me of art in general, and beauty in art anyway, beauty not in nature, and my thoughts that all beauty, beauty in art is all learned, and made me think about, for instance, about Rothko's paintings and how I was perfectly trained to receive them, to perceive them when I was about 20 years old, when I was a sophomore or junior in college, and that now, although I can still look at them and appreciate them, I kind of know too much, and I envy people who know too much but are able to put that aside and still really get that thing that happens in front of those paintings. These are paintings I made of Korean pots also, drawings. The top row are drawn on this celadon colored paper that I had made, and they're in pencil. They're pencil line drawings. And those pots were, they're very rare now and very sought after, and even then they were kind of aristocratic objects. But they were made in a very, very incredibly brief period of time, 800 years ago or so in Korea. The row on the bottom is made on craft paper with sesame oil and soy sauce, and they are depicting pots that were for commoners and still are. They're still made. They're for keeping pickles, pickled cabbage, and herbal medicine, and condiments, and so forth. That's one of the drawings. I was asked to be in this group show at SUNY Purchase at the Newburgh Museum, and I don't know if any of you have been there, but it's this brutal place. It was built, I guess, in the early 70s, late 60s maybe, and the term brutalist architecture seems to, it fits this place, and I wish I had a picture of the campus. I keep meaning to drive up there and get a slide. I was asked to be in this show with installation artists who were to make pieces responding to the architecture of the place, and I had never done anything like that. I'm not an installation artist, so I was pretty baffled, and I went up there a few times. I didn't know what to do. The place was so sterile, I couldn't relate to anything. Finally, there's this little graveyard behind the Philip Johnson designed art gallery, art museum, that determined the floor plan of that gallery because they had to match the width of it, I'm guessing. And they couldn't destroy this historic entity. So that's where I got my subject matter. Seemed to be the only human place on campus. ironically, the only the warmest place on campus. This is, you can't really tell. It's very layered. It seems like a flat green. You can maybe see the gray at the very bottom, but probably not. It's trying to duplicate the color of the moss that grows on the headstones in that graveyard. So Philip Johnson used the same brick, this glazed brick that Edward Larrabee Barnes dictated should comprise the whole surface of every building on that campus. And instead of having a continuous skin of drywall inside that building, he had these panels, which to me ultimately looked like huge modernist paintings ready to be painted. So that's what I did. Between these two walls is the rear exit to the building, which is glass and looks right out onto that graveyard. So I was painting this painting, the same green colors, but kind of mimicking their formation, their growth formation on the gravestones, and realized in the middle that I was kind of making a Clifford Still painting. But I don't think he worked from nature. These are huge, by the way. It's the biggest paintings that I've made have been almost in the shortest amount of time. This is a 1984 Dodge Aries station wagon. I always get a good chuckle when I mention that. My dad gave me, I had this really cool Volkswagen microbus when I was living in Oakland, and someone torched it. It just was destroyed one night. Someone lit the gas tank on fire. And so my dad felt bad for me, and he gave me his car, which was really a sweet thing for him to do. But I have to admit, I was just out of college. I was like 22 years old or something. I have to admit, I was a little bit bummed at having this family car. But it's one of the few material possessions I've ever owned that I became really attached to, just because I drove cross country a number of times, a couple times by myself, tons of miles on it, hauled a bunch of stuff. And so, of course, I made a painting of it, a la Bryce Martin. On the left is the exterior paint job, and the remaining two panels are the interior vinyl colors. And this is one of very few paintings, including that one, that Violet Please Do Not Touch painting. Probably just those two, really, that I really wish I had back. Maybe if I ever get enough money, I'll buy them back. This is the Metropolitan Pool in Williamsburg near my studio. And well, they've renovated it now. Unbelievably, they just put $4 million into it. It's really nice now. But back then, it wasn't so nice in terms of upkeep, but it was just a great pool, and the people who swam there are great. And so I just have many fond memories of spending all day in my studio, and punctuated by a little swim over there. And it was free, which is just astonishing in New York City. It's just a wonderful place. And that is a painting which duplicates the interior color of the glazed brick, kind of beige, glazed brick walls, and not so much the color of the water, but the color of the water, the tiles through the water of the swimming pool. That's the second version of the painting that's in the show of this house that I grew up in, Wallingford, Connecticut, and this is how I arrived at those colors. I sent these paint charts that I made after going to the paint store of all the possible pinks that I could get at this paint store, and had my sister and my mom and my dad circle the ones that they thought looked like the color of the house that we grew up in. This is a painting. It's very small. It's about the size of the torso of a first grader. And it's called Miss Mashinsky, First Big Crush. When I was in first grade, one day Miss Mashinsky, my teacher, said, "Byron, I really like that shirt." You know, she probably said that to 10 other kids that day. So I go home the next morning, I tell my mom, "Mom, remember that shirt I was wearing yesterday? I have to wear it again today." And she says that I did this for 3 weeks in a row. So I remember the green color very well. It was a turtleneck. I wasn't so sure about the dark color. It was either navy or black. This is the work that I had in my last show at Max Protech in New York. These are two fairly monochrome paintings, but they're no longer abstract, or they aren't abstract, I should say. They're fairly realist, done from photographs, paintings of the back of my kids' heads. They're called Whirl, parentheses, Ella and Emmett. And they're done on traditional gesso and with egg tempera, which I don't have too much allegiance to material or technique for that matter, or style, I guess, even though I've been such a severely abstract painter for the past few years. I had never done anything like this before, but I could say that about almost any painting that I've shown you before, in a way. And so they're made from photographs, and they're made with these tiny little 000 brushes. This is another painting that was in that show called 1961, and it's this kind of romanticized view out the windows of the first place where I lived when I was born. I was born in La Jolla, California, on the beach in this apartment. And so a couple of years ago, my dad pointed it out to me, and it's now an office. But I got to go in there and measure the windows, and I spent the next few weeks sketching out this painting on the beach in front of that house. It's I don't know if you can tell from there, but it's not, how should I say? It's not non-objective. Looks like water and sky. This is on the wall in that same show across from the two little kids' cowlicks. And it's very big. It's like 12 by 30 feet. And it's directly on the wall. And it's about this poem that I read in college. Each of these paintings in the show has to do with a place where I lived, and this is the New Haven painting when I was going to Yale. I went to New Haven while I was trying to figure out what I would do for a New Haven painting. I went there several times and I couldn't figure it out. So while I was in Brooklyn, just kind of agonizing about it, I finally realized all I did there was read poetry, so why shouldn't it be an illustration of a poem? So this is an illustration of the Wordsworth poem, I wandered lonely as a cloud, which is about William, through his younger sister Dorothy's notebooks, encountering a field of daffodils. And so it has a lot to do with me and my sister, my little sister, and then Emmett and his little sister Ella. People used to ask me, those belly paintings that were made in encaustic are like 10 by 8 by 4.5 inches. People used to say, "Are those real bellies?" I didn't know what the heck what they meant. Because first of all, they're like more the size of half of they're like more the size of a buttock or something. So I made this painting in response to those people. It's a cast hydrocal, which is a kind of plaster with blue, ultramarine blue, dry pigment flocking on it, and it's cast of my wife Lisa's belly when she was 6 months pregnant. 6 months pregnant with our second child, Ella. And I like to end with this frontal view, because when you see a woman who's very pregnant, sometimes walking down the street, you wonder, you just think it's amazing, and you wonder what could possibly be in there. And it's something that reminds me of certain kinds of modern painting.